Yeah, that one. Or maybe, oh, there you go. Is this test? No, I guess this is not working. Test. Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Susanna Kachatrian, and on behalf of Slack and Slack security team, I would like to welcome you. I'm here as a senior manager for Product Security Foundation's team. And we want to spend a few minutes to tell you a little bit about Slack and Slack Security's mission, as well as highlight some interesting career opportunities we have here at Slack. As many of you might know, that Slack just celebrated its 5th anniversary in February. We are a fast-growing young company, and we have lots of interesting facts to share. Like, for example, there are more than 10 million people use Slack on a weekly basis. We have 60 out of 100 Fortune 100 customers using Slack. We have around 85,000 paid customers and teams who use Slack for their daily activities. We have around 1,500 applications in our app directory, and it's growing. That means around 200,000 developers on a weekly basis. They build new features and they add new applications. So as you can see, we are growing globally. We have locations around, Slack is around in 150 countries, and it's growing. With that, we also hear lots of people how much they love Slack. I just started at Slack 4 or 5 months ago, and my first event going to ShmooCon conference in Washington, D.C., and when I was representing our table there, the amount of love and appreciation from our customers I received, it was overwhelming, coming from a different, much bigger company before. And we know how much you love Slack, but we want to make sure you also can trust us. We have a big security team who makes sure that we provide our customers secure work environment. With that, we are also hiring. You've seen probably a lot in our slides background. So we have lots of interesting career opportunities around product security, security operations, about security engineering opportunities. And one of our presenters here, Nick Kinkle, who is part of my team, he's basically the technical lead of Product Security Foundation's team. And you'll see interesting presentation, what we do to build secure by default libraries and services for Slack. Without further ado, I'll let Ted to go over the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. And seriously, thank you for the incredible spread of food. I think the only other company that's laid out something like this was Google, and this is actually a step up. So thank you very much. Welcome, OWASP. We have a code of conduct. I put this up at the beginning of every one. It's real simple. Just be nice. Don't be a jerk. Treat everybody with respect. If you have any questions, we love them. That's definitely one of the main things that I think is the best part of coming to these meetups, is I try and keep the talks on the shorter end so that we have a lot of time for discussion. Be respectful. And if anybody is not treating you in a respectful way, just please come up and talk to me at any point, and we'll take care of it. Our upcoming calendar, raise your hand if you're familiar with the Day of Security. That makes me so happy. Sweet. Okay, so Day of Security is on its 3rd event coming up. We just had the Boston one. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's a free 200-person workshop that's for women and people who identify as women, and the main sponsors are Lookout Security. They were the ones who kind of kicked it off, the little 10-person one like 2 years ago. But it was such a big hit that a recruiting company called CyberSN created like basically a nonprofit around getting women into security. And so they partnered with OWASP at Lookout and us to launch it into something much bigger. So the next one we have is probably going to be on June 14th or 20th. We're looking at the venue. It's a great place for recruiting. It's a great place for volunteering. If you want to get involved, it's very technical, and it's all aimed at kind of ramping up women who are into software and engineering and getting them into security engineering. More info at dayofsecurity.com. The next technical meetup for OWASP is tomorrow at Fortinet in Sunnyvale. Meetup is up if anybody is down in the South Bay and wants to check that out. The next main SF one is in July, right now at Uber. We also have, I was reminded of this before I could even get it into my slides. Wednesday, March 27th is this one. We have something called Hacker Days, where instead of having like 3 speakers like we do tonight, we have one speaker who does a very deep dive into one particular thing. Next Wednesday, it's going to be blockchain security. So that's also up on the Meetup page. Let's go back here to... Where happened to my slides? There. This is basically, I don't know. I'm just going to talk about our sponsors here. These are our sponsors. Thank you very much if you work at one of these companies. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to, is Tariq around here yet? Are you here? Great. Hop up. He's going to talk about securing autonomous robots.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Slack, for hosting. Let's see. All right. Here we go. Who here has heard about Anki? Couple of hands. Cool. My name is Talha. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Anki. I'm going to cover a few different areas, mostly just high-level what robotics platform look like in this day and age, some security threat attack surfaces for consumer robots, what kind of considerations we had to take around mass consumer devices, which are robots in people's consumer homes, some foundational security capabilities, both at the hardware and software level. Then some interesting stuff I'm going to touch about is how do we thought about reducing our risk and doing privacy by design and differential privacy on the voice, some vision stuff that we do around machine learning, as well as the data we collect from our embedded devices. And then lastly, some challenges between safety, privacy, and security aspects of robots. So there are various different kinds of robots. Some you may be seeing, autonomous cars, manufacturing, retail. My focus of this talk today is mostly about the consumer robots in people's homes. So if you're not familiar with Anki, we have various kinds of robots, mostly today in toys and entertainment space. This is one of our robots. To give you a sense of scale, we have about 7 million devices out in the field. We primarily sell in US, mostly English-speaking countries, so US, UK, Canada, Germany, France, New Zealand, Australia. We have a ton of traffic from many different countries. Even though we sell primarily in these countries, we see usage of our products, in more than 200 countries all around the world. This video fails for some reasons. So let me pull up quickly and see if the PowerPoint version works better here. So to give you guys a sense of what the robots look like in people's homes. So, this is one of our robots. It's running a smartphone kind of stack on the embedded device. It has a camera and microphone. Kids and teens are the primary target audience for this. You can talk to the robot. It has the Alexa kind of interface. Does a ton of vision, machine learning stuff around pet detection, human detection, so it responds differently to different people. It's 24/7 connected to the internet, so that attack surface is huge. The privacy aspect is huge for us. So if you look at we own the end-to-end pipeline. We design electronics, mechanical, industrial design down at the sensor level on our product. So if you look at some of the interesting issues around cloud, so over-the-air updates, voice recognition, machine learning models which run in the cloud for heavy processing. The robot does a lot of these perceptions, scene understanding, path planning, navigation, movement type algorithms, which are pretty reusable across all of our different product suites. We've also focused a huge on character, which leads me to the trust side of things. Our robots have a character, and they're personalized. They react differently, to different humans that they interact with. So the security and trust is hugely important to us. We want our robots to have a predictable way of interaction, and we want people to be able to trust the devices and the robots they buy. The SLAM aspect is pretty unique in the threat perspective. So it stands for simultaneous localization and mapping. If you're familiar with autonomous cars, this is the same tech they use around understanding the scene, moving from point A to point B. You start at one place, you start mapping out the environment from different sensors, whether it's camera or LiDAR or sonar. You start feeding in all these fused data to understand what are you actually looking at. And then you run machine learning algorithms to figure out, okay, is the sign far away? Am I looking at a human? What day of time it is? And then, the manufacturing side, I'll cover a little bit there as well. So even though the robot looks really tiny, like I mentioned, our stack is pretty reusable. Even the smallest, tiniest robot we have is comprised of 700 different parts. Some of the processors we use, which run, the entire full-blown Linux, those SoCs have 17 microcontrollers of their own and 17 different operating systems of their own. In terms of the actual stack, it's close to like your modern smartphone. The added complexity is different sensors behave differently and they consume data differently. So you have to think about security, not of just the software, but also the hardware product as well. So primarily, there are many things that worry us, but the 5 category of things is, one is, how do you think about product security of a hybrid product, which includes both the software that you're serving from the cloud, or the applications which are using the robot, as well as the hardware product itself. Then consumer data protection. These robots today are primarily targeted towards teens and kids for toys and entertainment. So customer data protection, e-commerce, voice, children privacy is huge. The third bullet talks about how do you think about bootstrapping trust from an untrusted facility. So even though we own the entire stack, we design all the electronics ourselves. We use a contract manufacturer, just like Apple's and Google's and Amazon's of the world do. So how do you bootstrap trust and transport keys and burn secrets when you don't trust that facility in an untrusted hostile country? Then intellectual property, tons of robotics stack is pretty unique and interesting from intellectual property protection standpoint. How much physical security can you build to protect some of that on the robot? And then the last bullet is also pretty interesting. Anytime you're building a hardware product, you start manufacturing your hardware at least a year before your software is ready, because you have to manufacture, you have to ship it around the world, it has to be in stores while you're developing the software. So how can you think about building some security capabilities in the hardware when your software is not ready? So like I mentioned, if you have a digital product, logical product like software, whether it's a cloud product, whether it's application, you mostly worry about data protection, confidentiality, integrity, availability of data. But on the hardware side, you have a huge variety of other things to worry about, including cost, including safety, including trust and privacy. So in terms of understanding attack surfaces, again, you have to consider all the ways data gets into your devices, whether they're BLE sensors, whether they are, cameras and microphones and dozens of other sensors. And also what kind of signals are emitted from the device itself. So to give you an example, if you just scan through your neighborhood, what kind of devices people have, you can start, figuring out, okay, my neighbor has a security device because it's emitting a BLE signal, and I can figure out this BLE MAC address matches, this vendor. So in terms of how do you emit pairing protocols, and how do you control some of that, and anonymize and think about privacy? That's pretty interesting. We do something which we call hardware threat modeling. So if you're familiar with software threat modeling, this is a pretty interesting work we've done. We'll probably publish some of white papers around it. But what this goes down to is, just like you do software threat modeling around data flow diagrams and building trust boundaries, we do apply similar techniques at the hardware sensor level around where does trust starts from. How do you think about trusted boundaries between different sensors, and what kind of security guarantees you can make from one place to the other, and how can somebody exploit one sensor and privilege escalate to the other one, even though they are very distinct, unique devices. I'm going to touch a little bit on the voice interface. This is not unique to us. All this stack which is voice activated, whether it's Alexa enabled devices, whether it's Google Home enabled devices, they have similar attack patterns. So one of the problems you have is, how do you think about the logical access control of voice? So, it's my robot, I talk to it, but if the robot is behaving and acting on actions that I send the commands to, how do you differentiate between me versus my wife versus my kid? Now, you could do voice fingerprinting, but then you start making your product more creepy, because now you're doing voice fingerprinting and you're storing them and you're sharing them. Impersonation attacks are pretty interesting, where you could just record somebody's voice and replay them for the robot to take some actions. In audible voice command injection, this is pretty interesting, where your human ear can listen and understand certain frequency bands, but when you have large microphone beam arrays, they can listen to voice commands and signals that even you can't hear. So this class of attack is called dolphin attacks, which is starting to get pretty prevalent in some of these devices, where you can carve a signal, send it to your device, and it can totally react to it. Here's just some examples I pulled up. Another class of interesting vulnerabilities here is, with all these advancements in deep learning, Lyrebird is an interesting one, where you can just record somebody's voice and use it as training data for Lyrebird to speak exactly like you. So what you do is, you could take a YouTube video, or I could record your phone call, and it just needs 30 seconds to a minute worth of audio. And then their use cases are, hey, audible type books, or a narrator. But people have started abusing this kind of tech, to basically have someone speaking exactly like you. The banks are getting a really hard time on support calls when they have to verify somebody's voice. So attacks on the vision side, again, I'm going to touch about this class of vulnerabilities are, again, pretty prevalent and getting huge traction on some of the machine learning algorithms. But one of the biggest one is, incorrect model classification. What this class of attack is, for any tech to recognize a particular class of objects, let's say in our case it's humans, We take pictures of humans, we run it through some classifiers, we tweak some parameters, and then the robot can recognize humans. It can recognize pets. It can recognize other objects. But all these generative layers have certain parameters that you tweak for precision. And what happens if you start having different kinds of pictures which look the same? So incorrect model classifications is an interesting one. Anything that can be trained can also be abused. So malicious inputs that can cause models to make a mistake. That's pretty huge. This was a pretty big problem in the autonomous car industry too, where they are trained to recognize certain signs in a certain way, where you say, okay, a text box with 3 layers of text looks like a speed sign. But guess what? You could basically completely abuse some of these things for the model to make a mistake. The generative adversarial networks, these are basically, two models basically just pitting against each other and abusing some of their assumptions. Ian Goodfellow from Google Brain has done a ton of interesting research there. If you're interested in the space, you should totally look at some of his work. And these, again, these are not problems that we face just on our own products. These are just class of attacks on how the whole pipeline of machine learning training models work. And people have abused, some of the leading APIs and cloud providers as well. So switching into some trust model considerations, if you had a software application, people are, or your smartphone, people are accustomed to like, okay, you have a username and password, you have a PIN, this is how you authenticate a user. How do you authenticate, when you have a huge variety of people using your same product, and what kind of considerations you have to take between one user versus the other? What kind of signals should trigger adaptive odds? So for example, you think this person is not the right owner, so what kind of action you should take? And that feeds into some of the product designs and trade-offs. One of the interesting ones we have is how should the robot behave in autonomous and semi-autonomous? So we have our product, and the robot is autonomous, and it behaves and reacts and provides some functionality for utility purposes. But we also have a huge developer community. We have about 10,000 people writing different applications, anywhere from 8 years old learning Python to PhD students writing interesting robotics applications. So we don't have a special dev mode. It's basically an SDK interface. You authenticate to the robot. While it's in the autonomous mode, you can make it go into semi-autonomous mode. But then the security guarantees are very different between those two. And then how do you detect anomalous behavior when you have millions of devices out in the field? So some of the things we build in some of our products, starting from, because we manufacture in an untested facility and we want some security privacy guarantees. So one of the things we have in our robots is very clear privacy indicators. So if the camera is on, if the microphone is on, it's listening or it's streaming, we have some privacy indicators which are burned in a separate microcontroller at factory time. And that's some code that, without physical tampering, you actually cannot update. This gives us some guarantees about, okay, somebody can't just put in some code on the robot and make the privacy lights go away. This is similar to like if you have, your camera indicators on your laptops that people love to put stickers on. Verified boot, each of our robot has it signed and authorized code. It has a hardware root of trust. We burn some keys at factory time. And down from literally the power on self-test, all the ROM and the bootloaders and the kernel and the entire file system is signed and verified. Which leads you to core authorization. You cannot run any code which is not signed by us. If you want to run developer code, even for that you need some developer keys. We also have a trusted execution environment. This is a special execution environment. If you're familiar with TrustZone, that provides certain security guarantees about privileged operations like key management, key derivation, and hardware-backed key storage. Each one of our devices has a unique identity, which is a crypto identity, and the reason to burn that at factory time is to prevent from counterfeiting and abuse. If we see, cloned devices, we can shut them down from our cloud.
We did a lot of interesting work around different app pairings. We don't rely on some of the inherent insecure protocols like BLE and Bluetooth and all the vulnerabilities that come with some of those stacks. So we basically have, a asymmetric, symmetric key derivation on top of an untrusted protocol, and out-of-band pairing for some of these security guarantees. We do a ton of work on the operating system. It runs Linux, so kernel hardening, binary hardening, reducing network exposure, and some of those aspects that would go in a typical smartphone kind of a platform. I'm happy to talk about some of that work. We do use modern cryptography and modern TLS auth, so it's bidirectional mutual TLS auth, so not only the robot authenticates the cloud also authenticates the robot in every single call it makes. We also sign and verify the entire file system, so even if you were to have physical possession of a device and you did try to tamper, this is something we borrowed from Chrome OS. Each and every block of our file system is signed and verified. We did build our own CA and PKI for some of these use cases, both for code signing, crypto identity, mutual TLS auth. We do have customer data encrypted at rest and in transit. And then I'll spend some time talking about some of the differential privacy work we've done, which leads me to some of our privacy work. Some of the interesting things we did for risk reduction, starting from voice, is we don't actually store any voice data at all. We take whatever customers are talking to our robots, we take voice data, we understand the intent, we save some anonymized data, but we throw away the voice. That way, if we get hacked, there is no voice data that somebody can leak. We also don't keep any records of anything people have said. We do collect anonymized statistics, which you can opt out. And we only pick partners that can comply with our very stringent data retention policies. Otherwise, we just don't partner. Training data does not come from our customers. So we do run separate beta programs. We do some testing in our labs. And this is some interesting trade-offs between privacy usability, where if you don't take training data, for AI to work well, you need a ton of data and optimizations. But for privacy reasons, we just don't do it. On the vision side, we don't upload anything on the cloud. All the biometric stuff stays local on the edge devices. And customer is in control of the data, and they can also always reset that, can wipe off their robots, and we don't hold those keys as cloud. So if somebody comes and brings us a device, we cannot decrypt it. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on just my last slide, which is called differential privacy. So, oftentimes you hear products and your analytics people talk about, we want to understand how customers are using our products, and we want better analytics. We basically said, yes, we will guarantee that you will be able to do that, but we want you to do that without compromising individual privacy. And the way we thought about doing this is, Apple has done some fantastic work in open source some of their models, not models, but papers. What we want people to do is basically start thinking about reduced data collection. So some of the work we do is, some data just never leaves the device. It's always local, it's always on the edge, we never touch it. Example, photos or vision stuff or camera feeds. Some data we actually strip off at source. So, for example, if you shouted some curse words at the robot, your user identifiers, your IP addresses are just stripped off at source. When you do upload them in the cloud, they go to a separate service which completely gets rid of some of the other identifiers like IP addresses from the request headers, etc. And then we also add a ton of noise around timestamps and zip codes and some other fields where we feel, okay, if there's just one user in this zip code, that can lead, if you correlate that data from some other data source, lead you to identify which that user was. So we have some buckets around, okay, in this bucket, at least 50 users will be there before you can query something. And that's where we start adding some of this noise. So the pipeline looks something like, you have your robot, so there's some privatization tech locally on the robot that does all this stripping and noise generation and randomization. And then there's some service which we call the restricted access cloud. No human has access to it. Only some services have access to it. The other magic happens here where these are ingesting some data, and these are aggregating to make some privacy guarantees. And then internal people from cloud operations and analytics only get access to this data. That is all I had. Please, happy to answer any questions anybody has on any of these topics. I don't know how much time I have. 5 minutes? Open to any questions.
What's the most interesting attack that you're allowed to share that you could talk about?
Oh, wow. My longer slide deck. We have a huge counterfeiting problem. These pop up all the time. People steal shit from the factory. We have to hand over really sensitive tooling for them to diagnose, to test, to flash, to burn secret keys. They leak it all the time, whether by design or for their own whatever. Detecting these things in the field is really hard. I mean, you could go after people who are doing this, in jurisdictions where there's copyright laws. You can't go out after these people if they're not there. In terms of cloud, it's commodity attacks, all over the place. The more interesting ones are how people reverse engineer your hardware products, because that's a cat and mouse game. We make some trade-offs around cost. There's one slide which I didn't touch, but I'll show you. Physical security is really hard. You can start putting more interesting obfuscation on your electronics, but guess what? People just rip it apart, go to iFixit, look at where the buses are, figure out how did you burn some keys, and if it's a premium product, then one exploit on one device will work on all your devices. So you can patch software, but you can't patch hardware once it's shipped. And these things have a long life cycle, so. Sir? Yeah, that's another interesting area. So, can you repeat the question? Yeah, so the question was, do we see any man-in-the-middle attacks? We've made it really, really hard. So one of the things we've done on the robot is the certificate store and the number of services the robot talks to is less than a dozen. The robot does not trust the entire internet. It only trusts the 4 things it can talk to for over-the-air service, for voice service, for account service, for analytics service. We actually remove all the certs. So yeah, even if Digi cert gets compromised today, the robot just doesn't trust anything outside the 4 certs that we've burned. And it's mutual TLS, so every service does MTLS. So without actually physically breaking, you can't just route it through a burp proxy for doing man-in-the-middle. It will take you a real effort because you need to push some cert on the device, and all the code is signed, so you can't put a cert without actually compromising and abusing a bunch of other things. We do see man-in-the-middle, so because we manufacture in China, basically if MTLS fails, shit just stops working. So from the factory, there is no trusted path out for us to talk to while they're manufacturing what is happening. So we make some interesting trade-offs there. But yeah, it's either, TLS 1.2 and above or nothing.
Question back here.
Hey Talha, good talk. So have you considered any security or compliance certifications to certify the security of the product?
There is no regulatory mandate to do so. We do engage third parties at various stages for threat modeling, code reviews, pen testing, both white and black box. We run bug bounty programs. There are some frameworks, and Etsy has one. There are a bunch of IoT-ish frameworks floating around, but there's no regulatory mandate. It's not an enterprise product. So most attestation frameworks are a joke in the IoT space at this point.
Next one. Hi. So I'm interested in your project around the differential privacy, because I know that I'm not an expert in that field because it's very mathematical and very difficult in implementation.
Yeah.
So I would like to know how far are you now in this project, and can you share some insights in implementing this project for your company?
Yeah, I would say we are probably the most basic ones out there. We want to do a good job. We want to protect privacy, but it's nowhere near how Apple does things or how Uber does things or somebody else does things. Our use case is primarily on the voice data because every other data it's like product usage data is very mundane. It's not interesting. So we very carefully worry about the voice aspect, and that's the service we mostly care about. I can share whatever questions you have offline.
Maybe I didn't understand it very well, but one of the things that you mentioned is that for the pairing process, you don't trust some of these public protocols like Zigbee or Bluetooth, and you've basically did something custom. In my experience, and I've actually been in cloud managed product business. In fact, some of the products that I see in this room I product manage them. Anything that you roll your own compared to a open source, well scrutinized a protocol has always backfired. So I'm kind of curious how you've been able to sort of surpass the sort of the rigor and scrutiny that the protocols like Bluetooth.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's very simple. For us, any transport is basically inherently insecure and a dumb pipe. The pairing is basically using public key cryptography. So two parties generate an asymmetric key pair, and there's a key derivation protocol with a physical presence required. So there's some physical proximity thing, like to put the robot in pairing mode, you have to be near, you have to click a button. Only the user that onboarded the device first is able to do it because it's tied to user auth. You get a notification if somebody else tried to pair another app because the robot sent it to the cloud. The owner gets a notification if there's a new app trying to connect to you, approve or not approve. So whether it's Bluetooth or Zigbee or Wi-Fi, we just assume those transport layers are inherently insecure. So we didn't build any custom cryptography. We just used crypto protocols to just build confidential channels on top of it.
So you mean like the layer 4 and above is standard public key exchange, and it's just that?
Yeah. The thing is, we didn't rely on like the Bluetooth pairing security that they offer around pin-based security or out-of-band security because.
Got it.
Yeah. Any other questions?
How do you handle vendor risk, like third-party risk, vendor risk, kind of processes do you have? Question was around vendor risk management for third-party risk.
Give me 1 second. Oh, I don't have the slide. But yeah, 700 components. There are many components we source, anywhere from Qualcomm for the SoC, Linux is open source, comes with dozens of third-party packages. It's a whole layer of like supply chain security and what do you trust and how do you trust, and some of that is contractual commitments. Some of them is you need to spend a lot of time, doing static analysis, dynamic analysis, testing, reducing your footprint, always patching some of those things. But yeah, both on hardware and software side, we have a huge supply chain and definitely a huge risk too. I think I'm running out of time, but happy to answer questions later.
Yeah, I just want to keep us on track. But seriously, thank you. That was super interesting. He'll be around afterward. Please think up more hardware questions. I'm sure you'd like to answer them. Our next one is going to be Colleen from Segment. She's going to talk about startup security.
Just making sure it works. you need notes?
Yes. Here. Thank you.
All right. This probably isn't loud enough. You guys can't hear me, right?
Is this better? Okay. I don't want to strain to be heard, and I don't want you to have to strain to hear me. Okay, 0 to 1. Sounds pretty simple, right? But someone who's a lot better at math than I am said 0 to 1 doesn't sound like much, but there's an infinity between those two numbers. And that is what you have to do when you're bringing your startup security from a crater in the ground to some kind of foundational level. All right. Lots of stuff on the long intro, but I promise I'll break it up into pieces and it will help set the stage for future comments and later points. So on the intro, there's a why would you do this? Because if you do get stuck with having to do the job of bootstrapping security at a company, you do have to ask yourself, like, am I all okay up here? I would ask that of myself because I've done it twice. And then go into a little bit of, if you decide to go through that, what do you want to get out of this talk? And then some meet and greet, some stuff about me and the way that the team is set up. And then the second big point is the shopping list, and I just crammed plan, politics, and people in there, tried to come up with something that was easy to remember. And then lastly, just some quick references and a wrap-up. Okay, so why would you want to do this type of thing? Because what does this job do to you if you take this on? Well, we need you to do this because there aren't enough security leaders out there. There aren't enough security people out there. We need to drag people into our industry, and the people who are already in the industry, we have to elevate them into security leadership positions. I need you to be the best leader that you can be. Furthermore, your company needs you to do that job. Your team needs you to do that job, and you're tasked with protecting all of our data. If we're security professionals, we're protecting each other's data. So get into that leadership position. There are a lot of small companies that need an outstanding head of security, and leading an entire security, compliance, and privacy org is really hard. There are some days that you question why you do these things to yourself. Why am I like this? So I would ask you to be honest and ask yourself, do I have the mental energy, toughness, and political savvy to make an entire company do my bidding on a bunch of things that they don't necessarily want to do for years? Let me pause with that, because that's the job. Okay. This is definitely not for the faint of heart. You might be physically strong. Maybe you can bench a lot. You might be able to lift heavy things and throw them across the room, but you're going to be responsible for more than just an aspect of physical security, so you have to have mental toughness. So this physical strength is not exactly what you need, although I would highly recommend working out regularly and meditating, because that will keep you centered for this painful job. I would recommend working on mental toughness and also grace. Don't let the job harden you so much that people can see that you've become cynical all the way to your core, because then they won't listen to you. And if you have that mental toughness and that grace, those things will be your biggest asset, help you through those tough times. All right. So, by the way, I have like a mix of weird graphics and stuff in here, and it's inspired by people on my team who go out and speak a lot, and I think they're really good on stage, and I just kind of copied their style. This one's inspired by Leaf, like to go out and find stuff that clearly says stock photo. And then David, who's not here, like picks stuff from the 80s that's really cheesy, but that's also dedicated to him. So when I've advised different startups in SF, because the job that they don't pay me for is there's a network and they're like, hey, you know about security, you've done this before, and you get roped into having lunch or dinner with investors or board people from other companies, and they just try to pick your brain. And sometimes I go on site. I've done that for 4 different startups, and the common failure mode and behavior that I've seen there is maybe this is something that is even going on in your org. Maybe you're a super talented AppSec engineer. You're very, very good at your job. But the way that you work on security as a whole problem is you work on whatever's in front of you, whatever you want. You energetically jump from thing to thing, and if you're honest, maybe you don't really finish anything to the point where you're happy with it. Or maybe you're just firefighting all the time because things are a mess. If you're this kind of engineer and you lead security, you are in trouble. Not with me, just with yourself. And your company is in danger because of this behavior. So I would encourage you to not be like that. Instead, did anybody watch the A-Team in the 80s? I did. Yay, oh good, thank you. Yay. All right, Hannibal, he's the best. So what you get out of this, hopefully there'll be some ideas that will help you formulate a plan to separate you from that ad hoc life, to pull you away from constant firefighting mode and be the leader that I know you can be, that you know you can be. And at least 60% of your time should be dedicated to planned work that comes from the plan that you made and you socialized to everybody, the plan that you started measuring. This allows for a little bit of time to be devoted to those ad hoc requests that invariably come in midway through the quarter, that the business is like, oh, we have to do this to support the business. And you actually have a bit of room in your schedule if you don't overcommit to those goals. And you'll be seen as nimble and helping the business, which is good for you. So yeah, glossing over this is way harder than it seems. That's why a lot of people don't choose this life. At times, you feel like crying, and I promise you, like, I have cried in the last year. Or quitting. You're like, screw this, there's so many better things out there. Or crying and quitting. Just variations. And the thing about talks, like, we all go to talks to be educated by one another. Each one of us has a unique experience with some of the same problems over and over. Talks are awesome because they're brief, they're cogent, they're like snap together, but they don't accompany you on every painful mile of your journey. This is why I will say here, try to take the journey with a guide who has seen this before and maybe has been successful at it. And just, we are hiring. Again, my name is Colleen Coolidge. I'm head of trust and security at Segment, but I've also led this type of thing at Twilio and at CoreLogic. Okay, so our org at a glance, this is how I think about a security org. See that security engineering is a large piece of it here. We do have quite a few people on our security engineering team. The reason why I came up with this was because of my initial gap assessment, which I'll talk about later. And the information that I uncovered myself and that things that people told me, it basically pointed me in the direction of, like, these are weaker areas in the company when it comes to security, and they really need their own dedicated sub-programs. And in fact, there's enough work for at least 3 years, maybe more. Okay, so broken down even more, that's not discrete enough. And so this is really kind of what we have going on. And for those of you who are trying to look here, you can probably see it on the side, but there's GRC, compliance, governance, risk, and privacy. That's like a whole department unto itself. And one point that I wanted to make here that Leaf brought up when he looked at these slides was, there are really excellent people that come into the security domain through all of these different ways. Maybe they actually were a developer and they've popped themselves into the AppSec domain because it was natural for them. Maybe they did infrastructure work and then they went into CloudSec. Maybe they were IT initially and they did more and more security work and then they popped up to the CorpSec level. But you will find good security people in all of these different domains. We're not clones of one another. And that leads to you, a head of security needs to be balanced, because she or he is dealing with a lot of domains all at once. And you can't spend all your time in your favorite domain because you will be a one-note security team. And if you were to do that, you're going to leave your company open because your job is to create that delicious layer cake set of disciplines and controls, different flavors, raspberry filling in there, to protect your data. Okay, and then up here, just for transparency, here's some of the domains that I've worked in that I have had more than 1 year of experience in. Notice that there are certain areas that I don't have. I didn't do any privacy at all. Governance, I was like, I don't really know what that is. I just called the whole thing GRC. That's why I need to hire experts. And I did a little bit of AppSec work. I did about a year and a half, but then that was before AppSec actually attracted people who had a developer background. Developers didn't want to have anything to do with security. So I knew that that was a weak spot for me. I did a lot of CERT. What I learned from that is I didn't want to be on call after a couple of years of that, because that's a really hard job. And so the areas that are weak spots for me as a security leader, I knew I had to find somebody who was just way better than me in each of those areas. That's how you build a strong team. Okay, so part 2 of this talk is the shopping list. And it's just my sneaky way of like cramming a bunch of stuff in there. So in the shopping list, the first part of your shopping list is the plan. Remember the 3 Ps. And your plan consists of these parts: a framework that you're passionate about or that you have to follow because of the data you handle, your own recent gap assessment of your company, and roadmaps to cure the issues that you found because you've uncovered lots of bodies. And what a roadmap is just a plan of deliverables that you have over a period of time. That's all it is. So the first part, why frameworks? What is a framework? Frameworks. Yay, here's ISO. The reason why you would do this is because if you're trying to move out of that ad hoc mode, you need something that's holistic. You have requirements that you don't know about. If your favorite thing to do is, I don't know, communication security, like maybe network security, bless you. There's one more, bless you. We'll say you're awesome at bless you. You're awesome at network security. And when you get elevated to a security leadership position, you spend all of your time and focus there. Then you're ignoring all of these other really important domains. And that framework will push you to go look into these other areas and ask the hard questions and poke on the weak areas and start gathering what you need to fix. They help you check your work, essentially. And also, someday, if you fill this out really well and you're feeling like, I did a good job, I didn't just focus in my one domain, I went everywhere. Well, the great thing about filling this out is one day you will be audited because you'll want to be audited, because your sales team will come to you and say, you know what, security leader, if only you had this blah, blah, blah certification, we could close this huge deal. We lost $7 million because you didn't have this thing. You're like, I didn't have this thing. Like, what? You need to get your act together before we get this thing. But it'll set you up for that. So it's a great way to build out your security practice. And then particularly for me, the reason why ISO worked, at Segment, we're handling event data that comes in. And I didn't see anything that was really, really sensitive. Because we don't have that in our terms of service that you're allowed to do that. But the company said, we really want to make a move into Europe. We want to be huge in Europe. And so when faced with the choice of using something like SOC 2, Type 2, or ISO, I chose something that was more internationally accepted, because SOC 2 Type 2 is something that American audit companies invented. Doesn't necessarily mean anything to Dutch banks. They don't care. They're like, okay, that's nice. Where's your ISO? So since I knew that they were going to do that to us anyway, and I knew that all these other frameworks are based on ISO anyway, just do ISO. So that's why I did it. Okay, yeah, oh yeah, I forgot that one. This is also my remember, I need to buy these earrings, so that's why I picked that particular one. Okay, the second part of your plan, so you've got your framework, you know what it is, it's XYZ framework. Then how do you know what needs to be fixed? Well, you have to do a gap assessment, right? That is the work you do that uncovers what your company is doing poorly. What are they screwing up? What have they been screwing up since before you even got there? Compare what your company is doing to what's on the framework, fill in the gaps in your knowledge, and set up interviews with people all over the company at every level. You would be surprised how willing every single person is to say, let me tell you all the things that we're doing wrong. I have all the secrets, and just keep taking it down. This also helps you figure out what areas you need to concentrate on, how to build out your security team. Okay. So this is, just a nice stock image of a gap assessment. You can do it really any which way you want, but you do need to have an indicator of this team is doing this area pretty well, or this team is failing on this area. There has to be something in there for that. Okay. So to round out the plan, so now you know the framework you're following, you know the gaps on the gap assessment. Now you have to do something about it. So your job is to come up with the roadmap, which is that multi-year thing of work that you need to do. And that's fun because you get to share that with your team, the company, and the board. And the reason why the roadmaps matter, you have to do more than just the other two, is because people are going to constantly try to knock you off your horse. What I mean is you're marching, you know what you need to do, you know where you need to bring app security, cloud security, and people always hit you sideways with projects they think you should do because they'll think that they know security better than you on other teams, and they will advocate for that you drop what you're doing and do the thing that they want you to do. Going back to that shows that you've planned and thought through this probably better than their random idea that just occurred to them. And it's saved us multiple times, saved me in multiple places multiple times. And the good thing about the roadmap is you made it, you have control of it, and you know that when you're done with it, it takes you to a safer place. So believe in your own roadmap. Okay. All right, so this is, I started the first roadmaps at Segment, and then my team came in because there's a lot better at me than all of these other areas, and they came up with super good roadmaps. Mine were not as good as theirs. So again, have your team do that. Okay, so the second piece of this, the PPP, the politics part, not everyone is on your side. So you are on the side of right. People should do their jobs because they're supposed to do their jobs, but those things don't matter to some people. They don't care about that, and you do. So by working the plan that you have, this beautiful plan, you've socialized it, and you're just like, I did such a great job, you're gonna piss some people off. That's gonna happen. So you have to combat that. Inform everyone why this stuff matters. What is the disaster scenario that you are helping them to avert? Even better, that they are helping you to avert by doing this stuff. Plug the message at every level of the company, your peers, your subordinates, different departments, executives, board members. Just become this like machine that relentlessly broadcasts your security agenda. And your team actually has to do the same thing in their own way and in their own interactions with the people they work with every day. So they'll be working with engineers, designers, facilities, HR, legal. You cannot be the only one who shares that message and is recruiting believers, because it kind of feels like you're creating this religion and recruiting people into it. I really don't see too many differences between security and religion. So also, having them work on the narrative helps them for leadership roles, because you should also be preparing your team to take your job and preparing their people to take their job, and then just consume more people and bring more people into the security world. Okay, politics, yeah. We've all had to deal with it. Just for 1 second, imagine your life, imagine your company without any politics. It's so nice. But it's not gonna happen, so I'm sorry about that. This is really what it's like. I also stole this off the internet too. I thought it was cool that people would post for something like that. Yeah. Okay. So there's a politics like checklist when you're thinking about who you need to win over. And, you want to change these attackers into supporters. It's the board, it's the rank and file employees, and then it's your executives. Why do I start with the board first? This is a recent lesson that I've learned. So, well, I'll get to that in a second. Your job is to educate them. As pointed out, they will be scared naturally. You don't have to tell them, how do you look in an orange jumpsuit? I bet you look great. If you keep doing this, you don't need to do that. I would say most board members in the Bay Area, they're a little more hip to what's going on. They know they at least have to pretend to take an interest in security. Otherwise, their reputation's at risk. I know, I'm terrible. It's like how it is, though. So how do you talk to the board? Like they have a lot of different things going on. This is not necessarily their primary focus. Your job is to roll up everything that's being done in a way that they can digest, and a way that they can see that thing's a problem right there. All right, so I did some stuff, and I should have fixed the animations. So coming up with a maturity model, coming up with things like, this is what I'm measuring, this is how I measure it. We'll just have to let it play. Okay, this is where I'm taking us. Isn't that gonna be great in 2020? I sure hope we can get there with all those greens. It's a lot of pressure. This is another way of doing it. This is actually from my friend Chad. He's made this and he said that it's worked with his board. I encourage you to experiment with different types of like at a glance, how is everything doing? Keep the one from like a year before and the year before that so that you can show a change. So I used like, mine was color gradients. This one is like stars and like circles. But you wanna show a comparison. Last year, everything was on fire. This year, the fire's going out, and like next year, everything's green, or maybe almost green. Because you will be asked at some point, why are we giving you all this money to hire all these security engineers and these, expensive security people? And you can show them, because you can sleep better at night. All right. Okay, next is the rank and file employees on the politics ladder there. These are the most fun to work with, because these are the most excited, most transparent, most helpful people that you're going to be working with. Roadshow your plan to them in any format that you think is acceptable for them. Genuinely solicit their feedback, because they know a lot about the org that maybe you don't know, and say, hey, does this plan sound like something that could solve a problem for you? And they'll say, yes, if you make this one change. If it's a reasonable change, make that one change. And now you have done something called buy-in, because now it's no longer your plan, it's our plan, and they don't want to let our plan fail. Tricky stuff. All right. So while you're doing that kind of stuff, your team is getting buy-in also and directly helping with things like security design reviews, threat models. That's where engineers get direct value and they get to have that direct attention from your team. Your team is hanging out in Slack channels and answering questions from, I don't know, maybe like sales or HR or just rank and file people like, hey, the badge reader's broken, what do I do? And then in the meantime, like everybody's working on the little things like locking computers, wearing badges, not tailgating. All of these things are gonna create, oh, that's a threat model. That's a really ugly one. It's not one that we do here, but do a threat model. But all of those things create that security tidal wave that washes over your company, like the badging thing. For some reason at Segment, people are really militant about badging. I've never had that experience before, but they will stop anybody and force you to badge in. Even if the door's being held open, they'll be like, up, got to badge in. I love it. Okay, all right. Politics piece. The last part of it is going to be the executives. And this looks exactly like the slide that I showed you for what do I show the board members to get their buy-in. I would put them last, so you have your board members that you get to first, because the board members can help you. So we'll say that your boss is an executive and your boss says like, hey, I'm gonna cut off funding for this project. I'm gonna take your rec away and you can't hire this person. If you've already talked to the board and you've already shared plans, then what your executive is doing is jeopardizing your shared plan with your board member and you. So tricky. And, but by the time you get to the executives, you show them the same thing that you've already showed to the board. And since they're really busy, they have their own areas of the company that they're running, it looks like you've already handled it. And they've been hearing really good things about the security wave that you've caused to wash over the company. So they're already starting to feel like, I don't have to worry about that entire area because the security leader has it. Yeah, so 90% of the time, your update can look like this. Occasionally, if your boss is an exec and is a little more detail-oriented, they might say, what's the next slide? What's the next slide after this? So you might have to do a little bit more work, but you can use this as your message. Okay, another cheesy one here. What else about politics? Politics is really important. So while you're doing all of this, make sure that you embody these things, that you are approachable, you're visible, people know that you're leading the security team and that you can be talking to somebody, you're consistent, you're thorough, you're confident, communicative, gracious, humble. Like try to embody all of those things if you can, it's a lot to ask. And then also publicly celebrate big wins. If your team has shipped something awesome, don't let 2 days or 5 days or a week go by. You make sure the rest of the org hears about this. This is good news they need to hear. Acknowledge others for their good work, whether they're inside or outside the team, and support other people's careers by writing their bosses and tell them how they helped security. Maybe you have an engineer who's been doing a lot of AppSec work for free. Don't make it for free. Make sure that his or her boss knows that they took time out of their schedule to make a huge change and what it means to the security posture. Hopefully you can roll it into their review. Always show your work and your metrics. Okay. So then, who is going to do all that work that you outlined in the roadmaps? Who's going to do that? You can start, but don't be mad when your real subject matter experts that you hire come in and just burn an entire stack that you have to the ground, and they're like, you know what, you're a super good leader, but this thing that you did is gone. Don't be sad. Just let them build it up the way that they want to and have ownership. And then also, don't be cocky if they're like, this is so great, I didn't have to make any changes. Don't be like, I'm so good. Don't do that either. Be humble. That's one of the other tenets. Your job is to stick to the capabilities and success criteria. What is it that's going to make your team and your program successful? Keep on that note. Brag about your team's success. Behind closed doors, you should be saying at least 3 great things about different parts of your team. Acknowledge and reward your team, fight for their raises, promotions, help their reputation in any way you can. Talk to your company, your board, and community about what you guys are doing. Get your whole company excited about the team's work and hire good leads who are probably better than you on certain things. So hiring good leads, that's the other piece of it. Why is this important? Because as good as you are, even if you worked in multiple domains, chances are your knowledge is out of date. Theirs is up to date. You're not an expert in one of these areas, and they are at least a working expert who's happy to do the work. Maybe you are, because of all your meetings, very slow, and they're very fast. You also need to demonstrate leadership by showing like how to delegate and just showing them like this is how I talk about what our team is doing. They will also be able to demonstrate leadership by your example. Okay, then the people part of this mixture of the shopping list. How the hell do you hire enough security people in this industry, in the Bay Area, anywhere? It's impossible because I'll have a slide up there that says, we're hiring too. Slack's hiring. Everyone's hiring. Who's not hiring? It's all the same people we're trying to hire. So in our quest to get good people to come to our group, these things have not worked for us. LinkedIn searches, we tried all kinds of fancy stuff. It was bust. And sourcing sessions with our recruiter. We had marathon-long sourcing sessions. Who do you know? Who do you know? Okay, let's look here, let's look here. Let's email this person. Let's email hundreds of people. That hurt. And then posting a job and just seeing what happens. Occasionally, you will get a magical, perfect resume coming through, and you're like, oh my gosh, I knew it. This was meant to be. But that signal-to-noise ratio is really high, just like a bug bounty. There's a lot of sifting. There'll be, you might have a senior director position open, and there'll be people who are still in school who apply for it. That is the mode. That's what we had looking at today. Okay. What has worked? Referrals have worked. And I know there's a bit of, I guess, controversy in the industry about that because people tend to refer people who are apparently just like them. I have another thought, which is that there just aren't that many people to refer. We're just the same small village that just goes from place to place. That's the main problem. But referrals work because security people, we're all cautious. We don't want to go somewhere where we're not sure that it's a safe environment, that the executives care, that we're going to get funding, that we're going to get fair pay. Without testimonials, it's just hard to trust. And so referrals will probably be your best bet. Okay. Another thing that has helped us, needing to create and maintain a very good reputation. You have to talk a lot. You have to blog a lot. You have to be out there. You have to volunteer. How else are potential candidates going to know what the team is like, what the plan is, and how they can help you? And a note on retention, keeping your people happy means, if you give them regular one-on-ones, career development, actionable feedback, exposure, and ownership. Being able to refer friends that they've worked with before means that they can start building the team with you. Like, this is their team, it's not just your team. It's a chance for them to build their own culture. It gives them a chance to have agency. They have control over their lives, and not every security person does. And so involve them in these leadership activities. Okay, secret shopping list. The last thing on this is don't be a chicken shit CISO. I'll get into what I mean by that. It's a really cute gif. So you gotta assess have I, and do I continue to, stand up for the right thing even if it gets me fired? Am I a yes human? Am I pushed around by my fellow managers, directors, and even my exec team or board? What is required for this job is you must risk getting fired for doing the right thing by your employees and your customers. You have to speak truth to power. And this is a person who speaks truth to power. It doesn't always work out the way that he wants, but that's not important because we have a higher calling, right? We're on the side of right. Speaking truth to power is super important. You have to be brave, and you have to know that you're going to be okay. As I mentioned before, it's so hard to hire because there's so few of us. So actually, people should not be trying to piss us off at work. There's always a better gig waiting around the corner if this one doesn't work out, so you might as well live your best life, do the right thing. Plus, you'll be known in our very small community for standing up for what's right and doing good work, which I think we should do. All right, and part 3, I'm wrapping up here, is references. It's been a long journey for me, and a lot of people have helped me along the way. But I've read some books that inspired me. I don't know if they'll inspire you too, but this one's a good one. If you want to step into a leadership role, I recommend getting this on Audible. And it's by Seth Godin, and he will be in your ear in Audible and tell you that you're good enough and you're brave enough every day as you're going into work and you face these battles and you can do this. It breaks down just like some essentials of leadership. And, okay, this one, Radical Candor. There are a lot of jokes about this book, and admittedly, some of them are funny, but the point is, you need to be able to have private, closed-door, maybe shouting sessions with not just your team, but other teams, other managers, executives, and board members. You have to be able to lay it out to them in a way where you're not protecting yourself. You have to tell them what the risk is. You have to tell them, hey, these people are ready to walk, so you have to do something about this, or I'm going to walk. You have to feel empowered to say the right thing at the right time. And this book gives a little bit of a formula, if you've not done that before, if it's scary for you. And speaking of tribes, tribe is one of our values. And we are hiring some security engineers. I promised that would be there. Yeah, it's actually, tribe is one of our values. That's fantastic. It worked out that way. We're looking for cloud security engineers, application security engineers, and a GRC leader. Also, on my way here, our foundation leader said we're also looking for senior infrastructure engineers. If you're security proximal, but you don't want to be on the security team, there's also good opportunity there. That guy's name is Albert. All right, so to wrap this up, just find the segment folks here, talk to them about what it's like to be on the team and to build cool stuff. And we make fun of each other sometimes during the day too. And so no matter what route you take, either you reject all these ideas, this is really stupid, it will never work, or you just copy them outright and you're like, I'm just going to copy and paste that into my current life. I wish you the very best of luck because you're going to need it. And so last words here, we need you to lead us. Remember, I want you all to be leaders. So get started on your shopping list. That's the plan, the politics, and the people. You and your team need to get out there, talk, and hire more people. And finally, be a strong CISO who's not afraid to be fired. And that's all I got.
Thank you for our presentation. It was incredible. About the people part, why haven't you considered something like an academy, internal academy, and just open it? So let me explain from experience. I come from a company that our developers and designers are in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And speaking of a different role, we were struggling finding UX designers. So we had some experts on the role, and what we did is launch a free academy with people that were interested in it over a few weeks, and the people that graduated from it actually got jobs at UX, as UX designers. So have you thought about running an academy for people that are interested in security, and at the end of it, you find, oh, maybe this person is very knowledgeable and we can hire him. I think that's another strategy that could work.
Yeah, that's a really good point. At a previous company, we did something like that. I think we called it hatchlings or something. And we got people who were interested in a particular field, whatever we had not enough people for, and we would train them over a 6-month period. It was a pretty long academy. And in that time, they would get their feet wet in a really safe environment, and by the end of that, they would actually be, this was at Twilio, they would actually be ready to work day one. I think that your company either needs to be at a certain size, or your execs need to believe that that type of investment, because it's a long investment. If you're taking somebody who doesn't know anything about security, and then you want to have them start solving some security problems, there's a pretty big investment that you're going to want to make. So it's something that I have like soft pitched to my boss. I'm like, look at this other company that's doing it so well that I used to work at. But I think it's just a matter of feeling it out. Because I think it's useful for more than just security. It's probably for every engineering position where you just don't have enough people for. But yeah, that's where we would like to get to.
It was a great talk. I just had a couple of questions from it was really interesting to see like the narrative, and I definitely saw a journey there and like how things were done. Just out of curiosity, from like where you entered into organizations, like from a size and maturity standpoint, like how big is the team, and when did you enter, and what is it now, and like how long did it take, that kind of thing. And also, like, it'd be really interesting to understand like how the current security org at Segment is structured, from like where it sits with regard to executive team versus like the board and such, because it's very different than the structure that I'm at. So it'd be interesting to like help frame like what's going on.
Those are all great questions. I think I got all of them without writing them down. I'm so dependent on notes, but I'm going to give it a try. Okay. It looked like Segment was ready, and not just Segment, but other startups I've worked at, ready for a head of security at right around 200 people. And it seemed like any less than that, they were just like, let's just have a couple engineers work on this problem, just knock out the security thing. And then when they get to about 200, they're like, oh, turns out this is more than just like patching some things. And it was one engineer who was there, and then me. And that was like a year and 8 months ago. What are we up to now? Like 12 people? I think we're up to 12 people, and that's not including IT, because they were like, hey, you're doing such a great job, security team. You roadmap things, you do gap assessments. How would you like IT? And we're like, what? That is non sequitur. But we took them in as well, and we're growing that team too. So a third thing was, where does the security org sit within the entire company? Okay, so we report in, originally we reported into our VP of engineering, and he is an E-team member, so he's at the top of the company. He just recently got a promotion to Chief Product Officer. Yes, thank you. It's not something I had heard of until he got that. I had to look it up. I didn't know that you could be a chief product officer, but he is. And he's been a really good advocate for us. And so it is dicey, right? Because every time somebody tries to solicit you with a job, you're like, where does the security team report into? Are they really low on the echelon? Are people going to try to starve off our headcount? Are they going to restrict funding? Are we even going to be listened to? And I think we just got really lucky. I can't claim that I did anything special. The day that I came in there, the rank and file employees came up to me and said, not joking, we've been waiting for you. I was like, okay. But I think the rest of the security team has gotten that type of reception too, which is it's a little freaky, but we haven't had an issue with people not wanting to listen to us. We really just put ideas out there, we make it interesting, and then people seem to latch on to it. So other orgs where I've reported up to the VP of engineering, the message was security should be not heard, should be in the back of the room. You should, like basically, you should magically somehow transform the organization without bothering the engineers. And I was very offended by that. And that person, the day that I left, he was like, "I'm sorry, that was wrong of me to say. That's, security should be out in the open. It is everyone's job. I learned a lesson." But if you're reporting into a VP of engineering and they're treating you badly, you can go somewhere else and be treated better. Don't put up with that crap. Did you have one more question? Oh, the company or the team? Yeah, the company is we're just under 400, 380. Yeah, 380-ish. So we have a really good ratio, actually, of security person to non-security person.
I think we've got time for one more, and then I want to move on to Nick.
So I related to the talk a lot because I come from a startup with about the same size as yours. In the absence of, for startups mainly, in the absence of regulation and a lot of attacks that are happening to my company right now, how do you sell like a big project? Obviously you can pitch great ideas and kind of think that everybody would like a great idea and build projects on them, but without a lot of attack vectors actually happening on your surface, how do you sell projects upwards?
Yeah, that's a good point too. That was something I was worried about going to Segment because it wasn't like financial data, it wasn't healthcare data. I was like, oh no, they're not scared. Turns out they were already scared, and it is because they're scared of their competitors. So I bet your company has other competitors that they're like looking over like, oh, they're catching up to us. And so what you can do is find out what your competitors are doing better than you in a security area that you want to improve. Better yet, if they publish some blog or it's somewhere on their site that they do this security thing better than your company does, you can go into your boss's office and be like, this is going on the roadmap because we're not just going to even it out and make it table stakes, we're going to surpass them. And this is my idea about how to make it better. Everyone's always afraid of something. I think it's just a matter of finding out what it is.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, last speaker of the night is Nick from Slack. He's going to get up and give a talk about image safety. I think that's what it was. Hop on up here. Before Nick starts, I wanted to actually come back here. Slack has left a whole bunch of cool Slack lock stickers back here. They're kind of hidden meaning for their security team, so make sure and grab it on the way out.
Scroll down to the bottom left. There we go. That box on the left side.
Sorry, I can't see it.
One more over. Yeah.
This one?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You got
it. Yeah, hello, can you hear me? Cool. Hey, my name is Nick. I'm a security engineer at Slack, and I think this is actually a pretty good talk to go right after yours. Slack is kind of just now getting to the point where we can actually work on more in-depth security projects and not just kind of constantly be putting out fires. So that's what I'm going to talk about today is securing image processing at Slack. So first off, let's talk about images at Slack in general. So there's a lot of different ways images can make it into Slack. Obviously, kind of the standard thing is just sharing an image or sharing a file in a channel. There's also stuff like profile pictures, which we call avatars. There's also a bunch of other random things that maybe aren't obvious. So stuff like uploading a screenshot to our app directory of some app. And also many other random ways that might not be immediately obvious, just using Slack. So anytime an image gets uploaded through any of these paths, there's a lot of processing that has to happen in the background. So for example, we may need to resize an image. If you upload a profile picture that's like sideways. We might try to check the orientation and rotate it back for you. And specifically, when you upload or share a file in a channel, we want to do our best to generate some kind of preview that'll kind of work across lots of different devices. So we need to make a lot of thumbnails. We need to make lots of different sizes of images, excuse me, from that kind of one master image. So long story short, we need to do a lot of work every time an image gets uploaded into Slack. So let's take a really simple kind of walk through what actually happens when an image gets uploaded into Slack. This is very, very simplified, and it's kind of a lie, but let's pretend that this is what really happens. So at a high level, people using Slack or third-party developers are going to be throwing a bunch of images at us. And Slack, kind of at its core, is this big, giant, monolithic hack web application. So hack, for anyone who hasn't run into it, is you can think of it for the purposes of this talk, more or less PHP with types. The hack team will be very upset if you talk about it that way. It's kind of its own thing that's not PHP, but for the purposes of this talk, it's more or less PHP with nice types. So we have this giant monolithic hack web application. In the background, not pictured here, a thing we call our Java message server that handles stuff like presence, channel, like real-time channel state, a whole bunch of database and caching layers, also not pictured here, not super relevant. But what is relevant is a lot of our AWS infrastructure. So when that file first gets uploaded, we will, or at least once upon a time, we wrote that actually to the local disk on a web server. Might have done a little bit of processing there, hey, let's check, is this a sane file size? We're not gonna let you upload a 10 gigabyte file. Maybe do a little sanitization of the file name, and then upload it into a temporary S3 bucket. A very important part of Slack's overall architecture is what we call our job queue. So it's very complicated in practice. For the purposes of this talk, let's just pretend it's just Redis. So our web application can enqueue a job at some later time. That job will then get pulled and executed. How that's relevant for images is we will enqueue a job that says, hey, let's do some processing of this image. Let's go and generate all of those thumbnails. Let's maybe rotate or resize that image. Let's actually do that work. So when that job kicks off, it will pull that image from the S3 temporary bucket, do its processing, and then put it in its final S3 destination, and possibly a lot of other images too. So maybe a lot of other thumbnails that we should show on an iOS device, right? So let's take a look at what that more or less looked like once upon a time at Slack. Something like this. So this should look PHP-ish. We're all security people here. How does that make you feel? What kind of things might worry you if you looked in some code and saw this? Literally, just what would people think if they saw this? I can help you get started. What about the file name? Is that kind of sketchy to just like pass in a file name to exec? Yeah, that's like super sketchy, right? Also, so we're calling convert there. So convert is an alias for an ImageMagick tool. ImageMagick being famous for both image processing and many vulnerabilities. There's also a problem here that you can't really see just from looking at the code, but it's a thing that happens in practice, and that's resource exhaustion. So turns out ImageMagick is not the most reliable piece of software in the world, and when you're processing thousands and thousands of images per second, every so often you get an image that blows up ImageMagick memory usage to something like 20 plus gigabytes, and if you're trying to do that in a shared job queue with lots of other jobs, that can cause real operational problems. So also a problem, you can't really see that from code here. Once upon a time, this is kind of more or less what happened in Slack. So what could we do to make things better? Because it'd be cool to like not do that. So first off, we could just jail the process, right? There's a lot of mechanisms for jailing stuff like ImageMagick. It's like a fairly common thing that people do that can let you do stuff like set resource limits, maybe whitelist the syscalls ImageMagick could actually make. So that's cool, but it still leaves us with general problems about shelling out. It's probably not great to shell out on a prod web server, right? And it could potentially also leave us with resource management issues. We've observed in practice through many sagas of dealing with various different jails that doing things like timing out a process when it should actually time out and actually enforcing stuff like file descriptor limits doesn't always work in practice, especially when you're dealing with many, many thousands of these per second. So that's like better than nothing, but it's not great. We could also just use a third-party service. This is pretty attractive because then we don't have to do very much. But in practice, especially for a place like Slack where image processing and image uploads are kind of a core part of our product, pretty hesitant to outsource any of that. But we could also use a third party like something like a Lambda and just do all this in a Lambda and kind of just not worry about it. That is really attractive. However, we have lots of internal tooling at Slack that let us do lots of cool stuff like canary deploys, custom internal security groups, fancy routing, all that kind of stuff. And we lose a lot of that if we just like use a Lambda. And maybe more importantly than sort of all of that is we want to make this as accessible as possible to lots of other product teams. We, the security team, can't really own image uploads forever. So we need to build something that lots of other teams can kind of use and work with, and Lambda, using a Lambda kind of restricts that. So we could also just build something else and try to do our best to isolate this from the rest of production infrastructure and the rest of production data. So we're going to do that, and let's talk about it. So here's the plan. There's a lot of ways that we could potentially do this. Here's one way. We are going to use Kubernetes, specifically an isolated Kubernetes cluster, to do our best to isolate all of the problems of processing images from the rest of Slack production infrastructure, and do our best to kind of segregate the rest of customer data from sketchy images. Why use Kubernetes? There's a lot of ways that you could do this. We happen to have a great cloud engineering team here who makes it very, very easy to deploy stuff, rapidly iterate on changes. It just works. And that's especially nice for teams that aren't us who might be using this in the future. One thing to note here that will come into play as I talk about the steps that one must actually take to lock this down is that performance matters a lot for Slack. When you're dealing with many, many, many file uploads, the slowest part of that is actually sending files across the network. So the biggest thing that we need to optimize for is not making extra network round trips with very large files. So for that reason, when we build this service, we're still going to go through our normal flow here where a client uploads that initial image to our giant monolithic hack web app. That web app does maybe a little bit of processing, pushes it to an S3 temp bucket, and queues a job that sometime later will do some processing. However, here's where we change a little bit. Instead of that job pulling the image itself, we're actually just going to kick off a job to our service, let the service pull the image, do some processing, and then upload all of those processed images to their final S3 location. So let's talk about some risks here with doing a project like this. First off, this is a pretty big thing. How can we avoid making things any worse, right? Like what we don't want to do is introduce any new bugs into this kind of core production feature, introduce any new regressions. And it turns out this is really hard when like the code is not tested at all. So that's something that is a challenge. Have a lot of things to say about that, but that's for a different talk. Another thing, this is very important, how can we make this thing reliable? So we, the security team, are kind of stepping into someone else's world and saying, we're going to make all of these changes. So the number one thing we don't want to do is break stuff and make everyone else's life worse. So we need to make sure that this runs at least as reliably as the current upload flow, ideally better. Also important, can we do this without performance regressions? It turns out we can. We can also do this faster, which again is very important. Maybe I don't care so much, but lots of other people who are going to be working on this much longer than me do. So thus it matters to me also. None of those things are what I'm going to focus on, though. I'm going to focus on number 4 here is how can we secure this service and isolate all of the garbage of image magic from the rest of Slack's production infrastructure. As I talk through this, I'm going to focus on kind of 3 key areas of hardening. One is isolation at the Kubernetes cluster level. One is hardening at the pod level, and then finally hardening at the level of the Docker image itself. So I'm not going to go through what Kubernetes and Docker is. I'm going to assume everyone more or less kind of knows what those things are. Those three levels of abstraction I'm going to talk about more or less map to the major levels of abstraction in Kubernetes. So with that, let's talk about hardening number one. How can we isolate this kind of garbage file processing cluster from the rest of Slack's production infrastructure? This is probably the most important thing. Everything else is kind of a nice to have. This is mandatory. So first off, we can use some fancy tooling we have to have custom security groups that very, very heavily limit what can talk to the cluster, and more importantly, what the cluster can talk to. So in practice, this means that only a handful of production hosts can talk to the service at all. In particular, that's a subset of web servers and a subset of what we call job workers, which are those things actually executing jobs. And our service can talk to nothing. It can't talk to our Solar boxes, can't talk to databases. It just can't do anything. It can pull just the secrets it needs to execute, but that's it. Next, we need to worry about S3. So like I talked about, for performance reasons, we need to both pull that temporary image in our processing service and also upload all of those output images to their final location. So this is a problem. What we don't want to do is engineer some way that a problem in ImageMagick gives you read access to lots of customer images. Then we kind of wind up more or less where we started. So there's a couple tricks we're going to use to do that. One is using this AWS S3 feature called pre-signed URLs. For folks who aren't familiar, what a pre-signed URL is it specifies access to an object in S3, and it encodes all of the access control and authorization information in the URL itself. So we can use that by only having credentials to our temp S3 bucket in a job worker, creating that temporary URL that says, okay, you can only access this object for, let's say, 10 minutes, and then sending that to our service. So our service does not have any kind of standard read access to this temporary bucket. It can only read what web app tells it to, right? So finally, we need to deal with writing those output images to their final S3 destination. So this is a bit more challenging. It's a little, it'd be nice if we could also use pre-signed URLs here and just have our web app say, here's where you can write to, and just kind of leave it at that. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple because we don't know how many thumbnails we might have to create until we actually start processing the image. But what we can do is make sure that our service can only write to that S3 bucket. So that does a couple things. One, it means a compromised service can't read any uploaded images. Two, it can write to that bucket, but it can't write to the database. So it could write a bunch of garbage to this S3 bucket, but it can't tell our web app to serve that or show it to anyone, right? So it doesn't, like, I don't really care as a security person. It would suck to have a bunch of garbage there, but it's not super scary. So this is kind of hardening level 1 at the cluster layer. I think this is by far the most important step. Step number 2 is hardening at the pod layer. So pods are kind of this abstraction. Many pods make up a Kubernetes cluster. So let's talk about what we can do here. So the first step is using, in Kubernetes world, what's called a security context. So this is a pod level annotation that specifies what a pod can and can't do. So this should be more or less self-explanatory, but basically, let's not run as root. That allow privilege escalation false annotation specifically means if you make an exec VE syscall, you cannot then become a more privileged process. And finally, capabilities. So capabilities specifically refers to Linux capabilities. They're a mechanism for giving fairly fine-grained control over Linux processes. Control of the type to let you do things like open a socket on a privileged port, open a raw socket, that kind of thing. Luckily for us, if we only need to bind to an unprivileged port, do a couple file writes and a little bit of file processing, we actually don't need any capabilities at all. So great. So that's pretty easy. It's kind of the easiest part of locking down a pod. The harder part of locking down a pod is actually dealing with the process itself. So Kubernetes provides several different ways of kind of locking down a particular process or a particular service in a pod. Some options there like SE Linux, AppArmor, and the one that we're actually going with, which is called setcomp. So a lot of folks here probably know what that is. The short version is it's a Linux kernel feature that allows you to have very, very fine-grained control over what syscalls a process can and can't make. Kubernetes makes this pretty easy to integrate. You just add an annotation there. This is actually real examples. Add an annotation at the pod level specifying what profile you want to use, and then give it a profile, which looks like that. Generating the profile is the painful part. You need to figure out what syscalls does your process make during normal operation. And unfortunately, there's not a great way to do that that's not run strace many times. So you do that, and then you have this great list. And so what this specifically says here is the default action is kill the process. So if you see any syscalls, just kill it, except if it's one from this list. So this gets us in a pretty good state, right? If someone actually can pop ImageMagick, they're only restricted to the syscalls ImageMagick makes in normal operation, which is kind of a lot, but it's not nothing. Cool, so that's hardening at the pod level, and there's one more level we need to take it, which is hardening the image itself. So images are the things that run in pods, which are the things that run in clusters. So this is all relatively straightforward. This is definitely the easiest part of all of this hardening. First, we just create our user that our service will actually run as. The more interesting part is running this little custom hardening script that we wrote, which I'm not going to show here, but I'll kind of talk about what that does at a high level. Ideally, we could just use a from scratch image that starts with basically nothing. However, because ImageMagick has many dependencies, and we also don't just need to use ImageMagick, we also need to use GhostScript, a handful of other thumbnailing tools. It's quite a lot of work to build all that using a from scratch image. What we can do instead is start from sort of a normal Linux image and then gradually strip that down. So that's what that hardening script does. It does stuff like rip out all of the user normal system accounts, make everything except for temp only writable by root, get rid of all init scripts because we don't need them at all, and rip out a bunch of binaries that we're never going to use. ImageMagick doesn't need to ls. Why does that need to be in the image, right? Repeat for a couple thousand times and we have a very small image. So let's say that we've done all that. We've hardened at the cluster level, we've hardened our pods, and we've also hardened the image itself. So where does this get us? So coming back, this is kind of a snapshot of where we are at in new file upload world. Let's walk through what an attacker can actually do. Before I do that, though, let's think about what an attacker could do in old world. So old world, we're just shelling out on our prod web app boxes to ImageMagick. Let's assume that we don't just trivially have a command injection vuln, but we might be running an old version of ImageMagick. So if you can use that to get code execution, obviously you probably have access to any secrets that our web application does, which could include stuff like session cookie keys. Any stuff a web application might need during normal operation, that process can then access. You also might be able to do things like talk to other stuff throughout our network. Web applications need to talk to a database, so if you can compromise that process, you can probably then also talk to that database. That's a problem. So what can you do now in new file upload flow? So first, you need to compromise the process itself, right? So you need to compromise ImageMagick. However, you can't do that without using any syscalls that ImageMagick doesn't normally make. So that's already fairly challenging, although it's doable. So let's assume that you can do that. Then you need to somehow leverage that to get a better foothold within this service. But since we've stripped a lot of stuff out of our Docker image, that's going to be pretty challenging. You can't grep, you can't curl. So you're going to have to somehow do that either from the ImageMagick process itself or figure out a way to upload your own binary there. But great, let's assume that you can do that. You have all this time and you figure out some magical way to do that. From there, you need to figure out how to get some level of persistence or kind of more general code execution, right? So if you can do that in the service, you're still isolated from the rest of Slack's production infrastructure. You can't talk to our message database. You can't talk to any other internal services. You can't make any outgoing network requests to anything except S3. So you're pretty limited. The one thing that you really can do, well, maybe two things, is write garbage data to S3, which we really don't care about, and maybe if you find a way to kind of control the image magic process nice enough, you can read incoming images as they come in to be processed. That's kind of more or less unavoidable. Our only real countermeasure to that is just killing, just blowing away pods after processing some number of requests. I think currently we're experimenting with maybe after 1,000 requests, blow away the pod. Obviously, you can then re-exploit, but we also have a number of monitoring and alerting tools I won't talk about here that should give us some level of confidence that we'll actually catch when this happens. Yeah, so that's kind of where we're at. I think this is a good example of like the kind of stuff that security teams can at some point do once you get out of the I'm constantly putting out fires mode. Application engineering teams often aren't able to do this stuff because they need to ship features, and if image uploads work, if image processing works, why would you spend a bunch of time and effort changing it, right? You're only introducing risk that you might take down prod. So it's a good example of the kinds of stuff that I think security teams can do when they start to get out of firefighting mode just a little bit. Yeah, so if this stuff, oh, fancy animation. So if this stuff sounds cool, you should come work at Slack if you want to work on projects like this. We're hiring, my team specifically is hiring for projects like this. We're also hiring for lots of other roles too. So come work at Slack. Thanks. Oh yeah, questions.
Hi, I'm not very familiar with this topic, so this question might not be valid. Have you compared seccomp with SE Linux?
Not really. SE Linux is really painful, and I just kind of don't want to deal with it. I think, I mean, it's fine. You can use it, and it works, and it's a super valid choice. Running strace a bunch of times and figuring out the whitelist is very tedious, but conceptually simple. And it's also very amenable to kind of iterating on it and making a better policy as you go. And also, I don't care enough to spend a huge amount of time on that just because things are so isolated at the cluster level. So I'm kind of okay with finding a thing that works and just kind of going from there. Okay. But it's a valid choice if you want to try that.
This is not a direct security question, but I was just curious, did you guys look at the upload performance that you're seeing and see if it needed any tweaking? You're talking about large data sets.
Yeah, did we, as in me and my team, or we as in Slack?
Yeah, because you're handling that, right?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, so this is, sorry, I'm going to go really fast here. So this is a lie. This isn't actually what happens. It's more complicated than this. Yes, a lot of folks have looked at that. There are fancier ways that clients can upload things to a sort of to an edge location very close to them and use S3 accelerated uploads to go as fast as we can. Modern uploads are moving closer to that. We don't actually need to care too much about that. Things kind of always just end up in this temp bucket anyway. But short answer, yes.
Can you share your hardened.sh?
I don't know. Maybe. Sure, someday. Yeah, any other questions?
This seems like a lot of work just for one I guess it's an important feature for Slack, but what was behind the decision process to undertake this project?
Lots of things. That's a good question. It's been a problem for a long time. This is kind of an intersection of many things I would like to not do. One is shelling out. I would like to not be shelling out on prod web app boxes at all. Two is I would like jobs in our job worker to not be failing frequently. Three is that there was, widespread panic around image tragic and various things since then. It'd be really, really nice not to have to do like a fire drill every time that happens. So this is kind of an intersection of all of those things. And it's also, it also includes lots of our other infrastructure teams having lots of problems trying to do more simple stuff like just jailing processes. So what led us to do this? I'd like to make all of those things better. In particular, there's just no way to stop shelling out on our prod boxes unless we do this for like every place that we actually need to shell out.
And second question, basically the idea here is to isolate processing of something. Has this project taught you some lessons about how you can isolate things and that some other things you want to isolate at Slack?
Yeah, it has. I have other ideas about other things I'd like to isolate. I think the biggest thing it's taught us is that reliability is hard, and designing security stuff, I mean, at least for me, this is kind of a bias given my background, that kind of feels like the easy part. Making sure that we can handle load spikes, making sure that we can handle several thousand, maybe tens of thousands of uploads per second, making sure that like we have good failure mode. So like if we break something processing, we don't break all of file uploads. All of that kind of stuff is actually really hard, especially as people are constantly migrating various features, adding new stuff in files. Many teams are iterating on this. That's really the hardest part. So that's the thing that we've learned, I guess.
You mentioned a couple of considerations not to use some serverless compute tech like Lambda. I wasn't fully convinced. Was that more of a political pushback from engineering, or was there any practical?
No, that was really just our choice. There are some internal considerations that, for example, we're doing a lot of changes right now in how files get uploaded and processed, and like are in the process of rolling out new features. And we would have to redo all of that if we moved into a Lambda. And that would like maybe somewhere from 2 to 10x the work of this project. And that would also mean that all of the file upload teams here who sort of own that on a product level, who are not us, would then have to also stick with that choice indefinitely. And that's kind of a lot bigger ask than like, hey, we're going to build this thing that's kind of more or less normal with what everyone else does. Yeah. Cool. So I guess we're good. Thanks, all.
Thanks, everybody, for showing up. I want to thank Talha for the robot talk, Colleen for the startup security one, and obviously Nick for the image one. I'd never really thought that much about all the images that I upload to Slack, but coincidentally, I uploaded a photo that I took of you to our OWASP channel, and it failed. I had to hit that a couple times, so I was like, oh, I know exactly who to go talk to about that. And I also want to make a big shout out to Susanna for hosting. She's the one who really coordinated a lot of this at Slack, and also for all the food and everything like that. Here are the stickers. Go grab one, and obviously talk to Susanna or Nick if you're interested in working here. Thanks, everybody.